In America, we've moved beyond garden variety polarization to voting restrictions, weird gerrymandering, and political violence against those with whom we disagree. Experts now wonder if a 21st century version of the Civil War is ahead of us. Not to be cynical, but many of the outlets we rely upon for information keep us engaged in verbal conflict rather than using their megaphones to help us, the people, find solutions.
Peter Coleman, a professor at Columbia University and a member of the UN Mediation Support team, is an expert in intractable conflict and sustainable peace, and has done some inspiring work in navigating what we call the shape of our differences. He has spent over 2 decades studying how we can escape toxic divisions and chart a better course. Most recently, this was laid out in a Time magazine article.
Coleman's premise is that when 3 conditions exist, we can actually forge positive change. We think we've achieved the first criteria. When people are tired of the way things are, they're ripe for change. And his source, a 2018 study on polarization from hidden tribes, refers to this as the exhausted middle majority. And that's 86% of Americans.
I am so embarrassed at the way that this country has gone. It's difficult for me to put my American flag out now because it now stands for something totally different.
His second point is that deep trauma, like a global pandemic, natural disasters, or we would add our recent cultural reckoning around race, can prime people for being open to a new path forward.
Coleman posits that the third condition is seeing a way out. He reminds us that we need to have better conversations and commit to a reset. This resonated with us and is actually something that we have been relentlessly focused on.
People are acknowledging that this is not who they want to be seen as an American. Regular folks are the only hope for this to change.
William Ury, Harvard law professor and negotiation expert, calls this the third side.
Normally, when we think of conflict, when we describe it, there's always 2 sides. You know, it's Arabs versus Israelis, Republicans versus Democrats. But what we don't often see is that there's always a third side. And the third side of the conflict is us. It's the surrounding community. Perhaps the most fundamental way in which the third side can help is to remind the parties of what's really at stake. You know, for the sake of the kids, for the sake of the community, for the sake of the future, let's stop fighting for a moment and start talking. When we're involved in conflict, it's very easy to lose perspective. The third side helps us go to the balcony, which is a metaphor for a place of perspective where we can keep our eyes on the prize. Let me tell you a little story from my own negotiating experience. Some years ago, I was involved as a facilitator in some very tough talks between the leaders of Russia and the leaders of Chechnya. Talks got off to a rather rocky start when the vice president of Chechnya turned to me and said, "You're an American. Look at what you Americans are doing in Puerto Rico." And my mind started racing. Then I tried to remember to go to the balcony. From a balcony perspective, I was able to thank him for his remarks and say, "I appreciate your criticism of my country, and I take it as a sign that we're among friends and can speak candidly to one another. And what we're here to do is not to talk about Puerto Rico or the past. We're here to do just to see if we can figure out a way to stop the suffering and the bloodshed in Chechnya."
Restorative justice is another useful tool being used by the Charleston Area Justice Ministry.
It's setting up opportunity for you to build relationships with people you don't know. And so what Restorative Practices does is at first gives teachers an opportunity to create circles in their classrooms where kids get to build relationships with one another and with their teachers. But then it also provides an opportunity and training around, like, if there is conflict and that relationship is harmed in some way, how do we bring that back? How do we restore that relationship? And it teaches kids conflict resolution skills. We watch little 3rd graders doing this together. Their peers were actually the ones who initiated this discussion. They had trained 3rd graders who would basically mediate the conversations between, their classmates who had conflict.
And Loretta Ross charts a peaceful path that we can take as we walk through the world.
So the way I deal with those is to go underneath their words and sometimes even their behaviors and ask about their values. And I look at them as human beings. And so they usually have the same kind of fears I have. I want my children to be safe. I want my water to be safe. I want my community to be healthy. I want jobs. I mean, when you start talking about those things that make us human beings together, so I can talk to anybody walking around with an American flag and say, what does that flag mean to you? Let us talk about the values that we probably share underneath all of that and see that we've just arrived at different solutions. But that doesn't make us enemies.